I guess what we'll do is we'll put up a YouTube immediately, and it'll go on Facebook, and then y'all will have to share it from there. So let's go ahead and start, because otherwise we could be fooling with the technology, as you well know, for another half hour, and we don't know why Facebook's not allowing us to post it or Zoom's not allowing us to connect. First, my name is Sharon Black, and I'm with Struggle-La Lucha, and I want to welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar, which is going to be extremely exciting in my personal opinion. And I'm not going to go into a long introduction. What I want to introduce is our very, very special speakers. As people already know, the webinar is really about a report back, a live report back from Donbass and Russia. And also we have Margaret Kimberley here, and both John and Margaret are going to be able to give us an analysis. And everyone that's tuning into the webinar will have an option to be able to ask questions. And just before we start the program, I want to make sure that people know to go and see where this is at. There is something called Q&A. And those who've been on, I think most has been on Zoom or Zoom calls too many times, but Q&A, you can ask a question or you can go to the chat. And when we get to Q&A and questions, I'll try to look at both simultaneously. So at any rate, I don't want to speak long. I just want to tell you a little bit about our guest speakers. John Parker has traveled to Donbass and Russia as an eyewitness reporter for Struggle-La Lucha. Parker is the founder of the Harriet Tubman Center for Social Justice in Los Angeles and a candidate for US Senate in California on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He is also a coordinator for the Socialist Unity Party and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Our second panelist is Margaret Kimberley. She's a co-founder of the executive editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report and author of the book Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. Kimberley is an administrative committee member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and coordinating committee member of the Black Alliance for Peace. And one is from New York and one is from Los Angeles. So we have both coast with us here tonight. So I'm going to pin John, who's first going to give us sort of a wonderful report back. And I'm going to stray from what I promised. I want to say that everybody with Struggle-La Lucha, you do not know what John Parker went through to get there to Russia and Donbass. And we were all scared to death for him. We don't have a lot of money. We wanted to send a second person. But I have to be honest, we really were scared because he was going to the front line. And I'm just being very, very point blank. And we just, we're still later, not on this call, but we will be raising money to cover his trip because it was a reason why we couldn't send a second person. So anyhow, thank you, John, for being so brave and going there and get it. So I'm going to mute my mic and pin.
No, I was thinking too, when I was there too, I was thinking the folks from Barotba, the organization that was really made this happen, and they were doing translation for us and everything, and risking their lives so that we can get the information back to the U.S. So I hope the anti-war movement appreciates, the folks over there who are trying to get us to get it right. But anyway, I'm going to set my timer here real quick. Okay, since March, the U.S. Congress has approved about $54 billion in war funds for Ukraine. And since 2004, this will make the money going to that regime change in Ukraine close to $100 billion. The Democrats unanimously approved this latest billions being taken away from housing, food, healthcare, transportation, COVID relief, or any real attempt to stop runaway inflation. That's right, all of them, all the Democrats voted for that. And as my comrade Gary Wilson, who wrote in an article in Struggle-La Lucha, to put this in perspective, 54 billion is more than Russia's defense budget for the whole year of 2021, which was 43 billion. It's more money than the U.S. has given in any kind of aid to any country in the last decade. So we want to ask ourselves, how did we get here? Which is a very important question, and one that can be answered truthfully and in a way that exposes U.S. imperialism as the perpetrator and source to stopping this war are answered in a way which legitimizes the avalanche of falsehoods from the Pentagon, from the Ukrainian government, and pours water on the urgency to stop this runaway train towards World War III. On April 25th, at a meeting with more than 40 NATO and non-NATO defense officials in Germany, US Secretary of War Lloyd Austin said basically that this is not about defending Ukraine, but it's a proxy war against Russia with Ukraine as the battlefield. He said, quote, "A weakened Russia is the goal." Biden himself also said that, that this is all about regime change. He took it back, but he said it. So I just wanted to briefly hear from when I was over there. I went to Russia and then I went to Lugansk, and while in Russia, met a journalist from Belarus who wanted to interview me, and I wanted to interview her. She's a pretty well-known journalist, Nadezhda, got her last name, and she works for a pretty kind of a mainstream newspaper called Minskaya Pravda. Now, Belarus borders Russia and the Ukraine, and so we wanted to hear what she had to say, her perspective on from the Belarus thing. But first I have to share my screen. Let me share my screen here. Here it is, boom. And let's try this. Okay.
So I'm Nadezhda Sablina. I'm a Belarusian journalist from the newspaper Minsk Pravda. I want to say that before the Russian military operation started, there was a danger that Ukrainians attacked our Belarusian territory. In a week after the operation started, Lukashenko, our president, said that there were 3 points near the Ukrainian-Belarusian border on the Ukrainian territory. And there were heavy artillery that were ready to attack Belarusian territory. So Russian soldiers that were on our territory that time, they actually saved us from this attack from the Ukraine. And when someone in Europe or in the United States says that Belarus is a co-aggressor with Russia, it's so disgusting because we were under the attack, under the dangers of the attack, and we just had to save ourselves. And Russia really helps us to...
On the border of the Lugansk and Donetsk. And did they have a credible reason to be afraid, the people in the
Of course, they were afraid, but it was not just, just a feeling that there's gonna be an attack. There were facts, many facts, that Ukrainian army, that USA finance and help them with this military equipment and so on. They were going to attack, not just attack, to start a big war against Donbass and also against Russia and against Belarus. So people in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic just had no choice. Either they start this operation with Russian army, either they just died. Because, yes, the war had to be started that time.
The Nazi infiltration into the military of the Ukraine, have you seen any evidence of that?
What evidence?
Oh, evidence of any Nazi influence in the Ukrainian military.
It's not influence. Ukraine is a Nazi state. We see it definitely in ideology, in army, in society, everywhere. We see this fascism. Yes. In Europe, people usually say Nazi. Here, we usually say.
Okay. Stop screen share. Sorry. Sorry for the roughness of the editing there, but just trying to get some of the pertinent stuff in there. So there was another, there's a whole article that that she had written that I can share with other folks. Give us your emails and stuff so we can share that with you. But that I wanted to now go to, we went to this village near Krimskoye, it's called, and in Lugansk. And that's one of the buildings where the Ukrainian military used to store their ammunition. We went to a lot of different places. We went to shelters, we went to the other places. So just wanted to show you real quick what we found there. Okay, let's get to this share. Boom. Right there. And there. If I were to take the paint to see how old this is, I could like scrape some paint off and possibly analyze it and see how old. I don't understand. You mean when they was dumping? No, if I were to take something and scrape it off and hold it. You want to analyze how old it is, to see when it was written. It was written when Ukrainian soldiers were here, not now. Right. But I wonder if I could test that. It's a good way to test. I am licking my finger here. And let's do that like that. Let's rub it really hard and see. Oh, nothing came off, which means more likely somebody didn't just come and dump. It's not new. And this symbol here, is that? This symbol means like a circling over the sun. This symbol use pagans, and so you see that the fascist symbol is very similar to this. It is like a sun turning over the sun. This the same, but in the another direction. Yes. And so here you can see that this place used far right forces, but there are. Okay, that's the end of that one. Get back to, oh shoot, where am I here? I am sharing my screen, aren't I? I'm not? Oh, I wasn't sharing my screen that whole time?
No.
We could hear, but could not see.
Oh, shoot. So you couldn't see the swastika and the black sun and stuff like that?
Yeah, you might be sharing your screen of you, but not of the.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
Stop.
Okay, 1 second. Let's do that again.
There you go.
Okay. All right, sorry about that. That's not it. My goodness. What's going on? All right. We'll get back to that. I'll get back to that later. Anyway, it was a picture of the black sun and the swastika and things. I'll get that up again. So real quick, let's just get this one, and then that's it. Now this was, people can hear me. This was in Rubizny, one of the shelters that is close to the front lines, where 350 people had come to to get rescued because they were getting bombarded by Ukrainian military tanks. So here's just one of the people. We went into the shelter downstairs in the shelter to talk to some of the people who are living there.
Were very frightened, and people were very frightened.
I'm not sharing it. Hold on.
I'm not sharing.
Ran out from this
burning houses and shout, "What are you doing? We are Ukrainians."
Ну, это не помогло. Сами солдаты походили, улыбнулись и отворачивались от горящих домов. Вышла и я. Я сначала думаю, кто именно нас расстреливает. Когда я узнала, что это Украина, осмелилась сама выйти. У меня дом был крайний по улице. И я вышла, попросила, ребята, ну я начала говорить по-украински, хотя мой родной по-русски говорит.
Я сейчас переведу. And when people began to run out on the streets and shout, "Don't do this, we are Ukrainians," the soldiers just laughed and hid their laugh and turned their faces from this burned house. And she went out from her house because she wanted to understand who exactly shot in her house. And her house was on the edge of this city. And she came to Ukrainian soldier and began to speak with him in Ukrainian, but her native language is Russian language.
Но это не помогло. Через минут 20 опять танк приехал, украинский, начал мой дом, мой двор расстреливать. В полном смысле.
And she adds that when she asked why are you doing and why are you shoot this to the neighbors' houses, she nobody answered her, but maybe 20 minutes passed, and one more Ukrainian tank came and began to shoot directly in her house.
And how does she?
Okay, let's stop that there. Only because I could do a lot more, but I don't want to take away from Margaret's great analysis and stuff in time. So anyway, that was Alexei Albu, who was a member of Borotba. Borotba was it stands for struggle. It was going to be a party in the parliament. They're going through the process of that happening, and it got interrupted by the coup in 2014, which I know Margaret's going to talk about too. So the U.S. sponsored coup in 2014 stopped all of that political work that was being done, and especially if you were a socialist or a communist, then you were no longer allowed to even be in a party or say anything like that. So anyway, Alexei was one of the people who was in the Odessa fire. That's a fire in 2014. The fascists went and set ablaze the trade union, the House of Trade Unions, killing socialists, trade unionists, and none of them ever got charged by Zelensky's government. Nothing happened there. But anyway, he escaped and he with his family to Crimea, and then he went back to Lugansk, and he's organizing in Lugansk. So anyway, that was what one thing is. And one thing to wrap this up is what we learned from this trip is that beyond the shadow of a doubt, we know that not only are because I have a lot of testimony from people talking about how the Azov Battalion and other right sector folks were leading the military in the occupied areas that they were in. So not only is Nazi forces leading the military, they're also, the Ukrainian military is also consistently and systematically targeting civilians. And this is something we never hear. And when the journalists in Donbass talk about that, they get arrested. I just saw a list of 5 new journalists who were arrested because they're saying what we saw right here. 3 media outlets were closed down, but one exists. One media outlet called the Kiev Independent, And the reason it exists is because the National Endowment for Democracy, the European Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and the whole staff has been paid by NATO and CIA money. Well, they're in Kiev, and they're giving the information. They get the information from the Azov Battalion and the videos. They send them to the CNN and New York Times and other places, and then it's distributed as facts, just like they did during the weapons during Iraq in regards to the weapons of mass destruction. So anyway, I'm gonna stop there, and thanks.
Thank you, John. And next, Margaret Kimberley will share her analysis and thoughts on Donbass and Russia.
Great. Hi, thank you all. Thank you so much. I'm Margaret Kimberley from Black Alliance for Peace. I'm editor of Black Agenda Report, and we included some of John's reporting in recent issues of Black Agenda Report, so you should look for those. I wanted to open by reading a tweet that I wrote a few weeks ago, and I said, Ukraine has lost. It can't defeat Russia. They can't contain or break up or weaken Russia without destroying the world economy. The $33 billion is a cash cow for defense contractors to continue a forever war. Phony concern for disinformation is to shut you up about all this. End quote. That's what I said, and I will go on to explain beyond the character limit what I meant. First, I want to thank John Parker for inviting me to join this webinar today. He performed a great service in going to Russia and Ukraine and reporting on events. If we had real journalism instead of corporate-owned media, which act as State Department spokespeople, it wouldn't have been necessary for him to go at all. But that's not the situation, and so we appreciate his actions. I think we should start with the discussion with some facts about Ukraine. It's not this noble, independent nation with the heroic president that's been portrayed by corporate media and politicians here. Ukraine is under the grip of far-right forces and kleptocrats, and it's a de facto colony of the US, which helped those far-right forces overthrow the elected president in 2014. But the Donbass region in the east, mostly Russian-speaking and left-wing, in fact, in some cases, still feeling a connection to the Soviet Union, resisted the coup government. And a civil war ensued, which resulted in more than 14,000 deaths. But the Minsk II agreement showed a path to peace. It was signed by Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, and was approved unanimously in the UN Security Council in 2015. But Minsk II was never acted upon because the Obama administration and the Trump administration and the Biden administration did not want peace in Ukraine. They wanted to continue controlling it, to potentially make it a NATO member and use it as a weapon against Russia. Peace was not in their interests, and now it's very late. It's clear that Russian troops won't be leaving anytime soon, and they won't give up the territory they gained. I'm going to quote for an explanation of how this was instigated, quote from an article, Black Agenda Report article that was written by Ajamu Baraka, which he entitled, "Why the Russian Federation Recognized the Independent Movements in the Donbass." Quote, "Unfortunately, with the election of Joe Biden, who was the Obama administration's point person on Ukraine, the Democrats immediately picked up where the US left off in 2016 and started to encourage the Ukrainian government to ignore the Minsk II agreement and to consider taking back the Donbass by force. Today, after the US flooded Ukraine with weapons, the deployment of 150,000 Ukrainian troops positioned along the contact line between Ukraine and Donbass, and the shelling from the Ukrainian forces right during the period that the US predicted that Russia would invade, the Minsk agreement has become another casualty of war. On February 18th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated he was alarmed by a reported spike and Ukrainian artillery attacks against rebels in the eastern Donbass. Also reports from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which had the task of monitoring and reporting on violations of the agreement, reported some 591 ceasefire violations on February 19th and 20th alone. In Donetsk and in Lugansk, 975, unquote. And having given that background, I want to talk about the Black radical tradition and how it impacts our analysis of Ukraine, and to say quite clearly that Black people should not be on the side of the US and NATO. No one calling themselves a leftist of any kind should do so either. NATO is the cause of great suffering around the world and is not the defensive organization that it claims to be. It's an aggressor and often operates far from the North Atlantic region it claims to protect. NATO's brought destruction to millions of people from Ukraine to Libya to Afghanistan. NATO nations back coups and other interventions in Africa, occupying Haiti, and act as US proxy. The South American nation of Colombia, far from the North Atlantic, has been designated a NATO partner nation. More broadly speaking, we should always be anti-imperialism. Imperialism is personified by the US and its allies. The US is the empire in this story. The US has the world reserve currency, 800 military bases around the world, and spends more on defense than the next 11 nations combined, 10 times more than Russia spends, by the way. So we have to be clear in our opposition to US foreign policy, even as we're exhorted to identify with this government and its actions. We're always told that certain foreign leaders are good or bad when the criteria is nothing more than adherence to US policy. For years, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been vilified as a tyrant, a dictator, a modern day Hitler who allegedly stole the 2016 election for Trump. He didn't, but that's another story. People who call themselves journalists routinely ask if he's a killer or a war criminal. The end result is any narrative that explains Russia's position is dismissed. But that means Russia's concerns about US placing an anti-Russian governments on his border is also ignored. That the expansion of NATO and its implications for Russia are ignored. Russia itself has been declared illegitimate, so that and I thought this was from The Onion, but it was actually true. Russian cats can't compete in international cat shows. The Boston Marathon violated civil rights law, by the way, and banning Russian athletes from its competition. An event celebrating the history of space exploration removed the name of Yuri Gagarin, who was the first human in space, from their program. The media are not just ratcheting up hatred for Russia, they are cheerleaders for war. So-called journalists ask if we should call Putin's bluff and risk war with another nuclear power. I think we have to talk about Zelensky, about Ukraine and its leadership versus what we have been told. Volodymyr Zelensky was the handpicked candidate of a Ukrainian oligarch named Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky is a citizen of Ukraine, Israel, and Cyprus. He owns a television network which featured the actor Zelensky in a comedy about a Ukrainian president. Kolomoisky himself was sanctioned by the US government for involvement in significant corruption. He and other billionaires looted a bank in Ukraine, one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in history, and then purchased properties in small Midwestern towns in the US to launder money. I think it's important to point this out so that we don't believe what we're told, and what we're told about Zelensky himself, who has closed down opposition newspapers, opposition television stations, declared most political parties illegal. So everything we've been told is not true, and the blue and yellow flags being shoved down our throats are an indication of war propaganda that I've never seen before in my life. And if Zelensky was put in office by a crook, then by definition, he can't be the man we're told we ought to respect and who gets standing ovations with addresses to Congress and the Grammys and the Cannes Film Festival. And you can't talk about Ukraine without talking about the efforts to close off discussion and eliminate every narrative except the one that's pushed by the US and its allies. And of course, I'm talking about censorship. The word used to promote censorship, though, is disinformation. A couple of times twice in April, Barack Obama spoke about disinformation, first at the University of Chicago and then at Stanford. He claimed that democracy is at risk because of social media. Democracy is at risk, but not because of anybody's tweets about Ukraine. His words were really meant to frighten Americans into accepting censorship should anybody dare to present a narrative that differs from the state. And that's what he did. Now, when he talked about disinformation, he didn't mention Ukraine. He talked about Trump's claims of election fraud and racist posts and things that liberals would support. But no, but Trump and the right aren't the targets. The left are the targets. And the need to silence the public about Ukraine was the reason for these efforts to address an issue concocted by the Democratic establishment. And less than 1 week after the Stanford speech, the Department of Homeland Security announced the establishment of a disinformation governance board. Of course, they needed Obama to lay the groundwork with his disinformation tour. Of course, only those of us on the left and conservatives spoke about the danger in what some called a ministry of truth, as described in Orwell's 1984. And while Republicans who are thought of as lesser lights and the butt of liberal jokes, such as Representative Lauren Boebert, spoke out against this very problematic entity, but liberals said nothing at all. Bernie Sanders, House members known as the Squad, and others thought of as progressives or leftists were silent. And while Democrats go along with and defend every Biden administration policy, Republicans held a press conference to share their concerns. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and others sought to defund the board, which actually didn't happen at all because they messed up their own PR effort. They didn't have enough good propaganda to defend their propaganda. But they needed this in order to, their goal is to discredit anyone who tries to oppose their state narratives, especially now when the Ukraine crisis needs a constant supply of public buy-in. But the question has to be asked about liberal silence. There was a time when they would be the first to oppose government overreach, including any efforts to control discourse, or even give an appearance of limiting what was deemed acceptable to speak and write. But liberals are joined at the hip with the Democratic Party, and that means they are the worst purveyors of misinformation and the group most interested in censorship. Now Ukraine is the focus of their attack, and the Biden administration needs to misdirect attention from its instigation of the crisis. By the way, I wanted to mention one thing. Do you remember in January when they kept saying Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, and then Biden said, it was very odd. He said, well, if it's a little mini incursion, that's not so bad. And it was very strange, and people wondered if Joe was being confused again. But I think he gave the game away. They instigated this, but they did not get what they wanted. But they want the public to accept every claim without question and believe that Putin is evil, that the Ukrainian military can defeat the bigger, better equipped and better staffed Russian army, and keep silent when another $40 billion is spent on this effort. They don't want the public to question why their needs are deemed too expensive while Ukraine is turned into a forever war and a cash cow for the military industrial complex. Biden's forced to create stupid expressions like Putin's price hikes to explain sanctions that can't hurt Russia, but hurt Americans. And liberals are at the heart of this problem. It's Democrats who have the power to declare certain thoughts unthinkable and make sure that inconvenient narratives are not heard. So you can sneer at Lauren Boebert or McCarthy or anybody else, but they have more to say for themselves than Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And the people making fun of Republicans would be far more effective if they made demands of fake heroes in the liberal class. But of course, if they did that, they wouldn't be liberals, they just would be true leftists. At Black Alliance for Peace, we released a statement, several statements actually, on Ukraine, in which we said that we need to decenter Europe, even as we talk about a crisis in Europe and talk about imperialism. Imperialism creates victims, not just in the targeted nation, but in the imperial core itself. European nations have endangered their own energy supply, that is to say, Russian natural gas, in order to follow the dictates of the US. In fact, the Biden administration instigated the crisis in order to sever European ties with Russia. They wanted to kill the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project between Germany and Russia. Now a new and unfortunately inexperienced German leadership has acted against its country's interests. They comically run all over the world seeking replacement for the most logical and least harmful source of energy, Russian natural gas, and create dependence on US fracked gas, which would be more expensive and worse for the environment. But the Biden administration, I think it's important to point out, they're also not very smart. They actually believed, what John McCain said about Russia just being a gas station masquerading as a country and nonsense like that. The Russian economy is clearly integrated with the rest of the world. It's not wholly dependent upon oil and gas. And in case anybody doubted that, the ruble has actually gone up in value since sanctions were imposed. But the rest of the world is suffering. A few weeks ago, I read that domestic flights were temporarily postponed in Nigeria because gas prices are too high. And that's the way the market works. They always talk about the market, right? Supply and demand. If Russian energy is sanctioned, the cost of the supply is less and the cost of fuel goes up. Fertilizer, there are people all over the world who can't afford fertilizer. Food supplies are shrinking and prices are high because Russia and Ukraine are both major grain exporters. I will close by saying that Russia's winning. Donbass is nearly completely taken. Mariupol is taken. Liman is taken. The Azovstal plant is taken. Sverdlovsk is probably next. And all talk of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv was made up out of whole cloth. In the past week, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz and other European leaders have called Vladimir Putin late in the day to do what should have been done for the past 8 years, engage in good faith negotiations. Now they are waiting to fight to the last Ukrainian, as it were, with Ukrainians dying in large numbers as Russia methodically dismantles its military. It's no accident that the New York Times implied that talks should take place and that Henry Kissinger said the same thing and added that Ukraine should accept that its territory is lost. By the way, I know Kissinger should burn in hell if he ever passes away, but it's significant that he said these words so publicly and at the World Economic Forum in Davos, no less. All claims of Ukrainian victory are just whistling past the graveyard. But we don't need the New York Times or Kissinger to validate our views. I assume everybody in this meeting is an anti-imperialist and that we must continue in that vein, telling the truth about Ukraine and about the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. We're going to begin question and answers, but first I wanted to make a few announcements where I'll be really taken to task on this. One is a very important announcement that Struggle-La Lucha is in the process of publishing and will be publishing a book on particularly Donbass. Many people are probably on this call familiar with Greg Butterfield, who's been covering that struggle for a very, very long time, since 2014. And it's been neglected by a lot in the movement. And so we're going to be publishing a book, and we'll be getting that information out to people. And again, people can go to struggle-la-lucha.org to pick up on any, because I know that John wasn't able to get all of the video up there. Some of those videos are already up there on Struggle-La Lucha's webpage. So please go there and subscribe if you can. So I'm asking people to try to, go ahead, John.
Yeah, if we can just, while people are getting questions ready or stuff, like I have this video ready again now, so.
Oh, okay.
Quick.
You want to share that?
Yeah.
Cool.
Share my screen. Boom,
Hit the,
bam, and start. Let's see. And this is one of the places that the Ukrainian military had.
If I were to take the paint to see how old this is, I could like scrape some paint off and possibly analyze it and see how old.
I don't understand. You mean when it was done?
No, if I were to take something and scrape it off and hold it and
You
put it
you went
to analyze how old it is, to see when it was written.
But it was written when Ukrainian soldiers were here, not now.
Right. But I wonder if I could test that.
How can
Licking my finger here, and let's do that like that. Let's rub it really hard and see. Oh, nothing came off, which means more likely somebody didn't just come and go. It's not new. And this symbol here, is that?
this symbol means like a circling of the sun. This symbol use pagans, and so you see that the fascist symbol is very similar to this. It is like a sun turning of the sun, and this the same, but in the another
Direction.
Another direction, yes. So here you can see that this place used far right forces.
But there are other people who use that.
Okay, that's it. I'm sorry. And so, and we found other evidence like that. There's a right-wing soccer team. I think that's where the right sector name came from. And that was plastered on some other walls. I forgot the name of it. Shoot. Anyway, but there's lots of evidence. Some folks had found, books like Mein Kampf that were left over and things like that. And just to let people know, this isn't the first time that the U.S. has assisted Nazi forces around the world. This isn't the first time. And it just tells you about the nature, like what Margaret was talking about the nature of NATO, the most belligerent, the dangerous organization and violent organization, military alliance the world has ever seen. And so we shouldn't be surprised when, as soon as the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, they took advantage of that in 1999, bombed 10,000 homes in Yugoslavia, bombed passenger trains, killing Chinese journalists, and then all the other havoc they've wreaked in the destruction of Libya and the millions killed and the 500,000 in Iraq. So nobody should be surprised about them cynically using Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia. That's it.
thank you, John. Margaret, did you want to say anything before I read the first question?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what I was saying. We need to call for the dismantling of NATO. So obviously Ukraine doesn't need to be a member of NATO, but there doesn't need to be a NATO. It was supposed to be defensive and defend against the Soviet Union, which collapsed 30 years ago, and its Warsaw Pact nations are now part of NATO. So we don't need it at all. And so that needs to be a point of our advocacy all the time. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and read the first thing. Its question is from Teresa Alamin. Have the panelists seen the film Donbass made by a Ukrainian filmmaker and aided by the EU, but billed as an anti-war satiric film, but is clearly propaganda?
I've not seen it. I'm not aware of it.
John?
What was it called? I'm sorry.
It's a film, you've seen the film Donbass. It's made by a Ukrainian filmmaker.
Oh, no, I haven't seen it.
Teresa, I don't think anyone saw it. I think if you want to put in chat what it's about, that's cool. And the other question is, will we reconfigure the chat so it can be saved and individual posts can be copied? Yes, we'll do our very best on that.
I mean, I know there was a film that was in response to Oliver Stone's film, I think. Was that in response to that? I think it was in response to that. And so, of course, they use the same misinformation that it's interesting that when this thing first happened, they're saying that the Israeli bombing the Palestinians, they were showing pictures of that, and no, that was they were saying, no, that's the Russians bombing the Ukrainians, but it was actually the Israelis bombing the Palestinians, and they're using all kinds of tricks like that, and I think they kind of use that kind of information in those kinds of films. That's it.
Yes. Any other questions or comments that people have? There's tons of stuff that's been written in chat. Okay, here's 2 new messages. So I'm just going to read this if somebody wants to be thinking about the question. Galaxy Notes. I don't know who Galaxy Notes is, but that's a person. I actually voted no to NATO, like most Basques, but the Spanish majority voted in favor, and we Basques are an unwilling member of NATO ever since. Thank you, and I'm sorry that there's no name on the actual post. Anybody else have a question? Okay, we have another question. Okay, the next question is by Dan. The average voter seems to care more about the pocketbook issues than foreign policy. How would you convince them of the economic harm done to them by Washington's response? Great question. John or Margaret, whoever wants to go.
Well, we have to fight against the war propaganda. We have inflation. Well, the biggest reason we have inflation in the country is corporate profit making, but fuel prices have gone up because of the sanctions against Russia. The sanctions to hurt Russia are hurting the rest of the world. And it's no accident that the same people who are trying to harangue and indoctrinate us don't tell us this very simple truth. Russia has been hurt by sanctions. I'm not saying they have not been, but they really believed they were going to destroy Russia's economy. They really thought that was going to happen. And I just want to emphasize something I said. We're dealing with an administration that's just not very smart. And they believe things that are frankly just fantasy. So I think it's important for us to tell people, and all this propaganda, the blue and yellow flags, Zelensky everywhere, they have to keep this lie going, because you might say, well, what happened to the child tax credit, or what happened to the COVID relief? They're trying to tell you it should go to the police. What happened to money to help the people? So Biden is really stuck because there was all this propaganda in his favor. He's more progressive than anybody since FDR. He's cut child poverty in half. Not true, not true. And now they're constantly sending public money, stealing public resources for the military industrial complex in Ukraine. So I would just keep it very simple. The military budget, it's most of discretionary spending, and it's why we can't have nice things in this country. It literally is. And at a time when people have such great need, the fact that it's all going to Raytheon and McDonnell Douglas and whoever the hell else in Ukraine is a betrayal of the American people and what they expected to happen when they made what they were told was this big change by putting Biden in office.
Thank you. John, you want to add something?
Yeah, that's absolutely. And it goes to the other question too about the reluctance of being a NATO state, because the people in these countries, like Margaret's saying, are suffering economically because of these policies, but it also gives us an opportunity to, like the other question was leading to, an opportunity to heighten those contradictions and to heighten the divisions between the NATO countries, because their people, we got to talk about the fact that, it's like Margaret was saying, that inflation's the highest it's ever been in 40 years. And it's affecting everyone here. It's especially affecting people in the developing world. But here as well, more people are going to be homeless. More people are suffering. They can't get enough food. So all of these things are so important in getting solidarity with our working class and fighting on those struggles when they start getting evicted and they start all these other kinds of things. And with inflation, they're going to try to use unemployment to fix it instead of doing what they need to do to increase the supply chain by manufacturing jobs on bridges, making more hospitals, making baby formula factories. Richest country in the world, we don't have enough baby formula. So we have to point out these things that things can be done right now to help, and they're not being done. Instead, Biden is hurting in so many ways in terms of COVID. 1 million people have died in this country because of COVID, over 1 million because of the recklessness. And Biden has the nerve to send $16 billion of COVID relief to Ukraine so Ukrainian Nazis can, play with their guns over there. And then he goes to what's this guy, Eric Adams in New York, the mayor of New York, the guy who likes Black cops who kill Black people. That's the kind of Eric Adams, I think his name. That he went and met with him and told him, the federal money that we got, they got ARPA funds and CARES fund. He said, instead of using that federal money for what it's supposed to be, for COVID relief, is what it's supposed to be, use it to hire more cops. He told him that, So he really likes to fund white supremacy, whether it's from these racist cops killing our children, or whether it's the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian Nazis leading the military there.
Thank you, John. We have a whole lot of questions.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to somebody in the chat who said they weren't actually asking a question about a movie, but about Black Alliance for Peace appearing to support Putin. We don't support anybody. We always support the people. We support people all over the world, and their right to be free from US and NATO aggression. But, the facts are the facts. It is the US insistence upon trying to use Ukraine to attack Russia that has caused this problem. And I think that one can make that statement because it's absolutely true. That's what the Secretary of Defense said, did he not? We're trying to weaken Russia. So pointing that out is not to say that we support a particular state. We are just telling the truth as it is.
Thank you, Margaret, for clarifying that. Now we got a lot of questions and I don't know where to start, and there's been some in chat. I don't know if it's okay with John and Margaret if I read a couple of them and then you all can kind of cherry pick back and forth, and we'll just make sure that we deal with everyone's question just because of time. Our question is, and I'm not going to stop at this. Our question, is there an authentic independence movement in Donbass, or was this a fig leaf for Russian annexation of Donbass? That's one question, if y'all want to jot it down or anything, or just if you're better than me, keep it in your head. The other is any comments on the history, Operation Bloodstone, Reinhard, Gehlen, OUN in the 1950s. And then they have blowback by Christopher Simpson. And then there's two more questions, and I apologize. And John or Margaret, you can go and ask me to reread some of this. In addition to educational Zoom meetings like this, I think this question goes at my heart. What other ways can we help bring together genuine anti-war forces? We need a wide coalition of conscious orgs and individuals who have a long time analysis of Ukraine, Russia. Can we bring the other forces in US, Canada, Europe, who are so much clearer on this issue? And oh my gosh, I didn't know there's even more. And Cleo, and that's by Eleanor Mani. And then Cleo Carroll Knopf as how do we show the connection between the support for Nazis in Ukraine and Nazis in America? It seems with more mass shootings that the menace we support in Ukraine is coming home. There's too many others. I'm going to stop there because, you know, unless you want me to keep going, I think John and Margaret, they're all divergent questions. You want me to stop?
Yeah, I'll just
Okay.
start. I don't know about Operation Bloodstone. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what that is, so I can't answer the question. What other ways can we bring anti-war forces together? And we can, you know, I don't know that anti-war forces in Europe are so much clearer on this issue. This propaganda is worldwide, and there are many people in Germany. The Green Party, who we think of as being left, are the ones who are most warlike against Russia, who were most adamant about canceling the Nord Stream 2 agreement, which hurt their country so very badly. But yes, we do need to be in solidarity internationally. And someone mentioned support for Nazis in the US. I did not mention John did touch on the fact that, you know, they're trying to walk it for years. I'll give you an example. The New York Times for years called the Azov Battalion neo-Nazi. Now they just call them right wing. There's a long history of during the war of collaboration with Nazis in Ukraine. And there are, you know, this black sun symbol, the troops they've captured with these swastika tattoos and the black sun. They had to start airbrushing all the black sun symbols off of photos of Ukrainian soldiers. And yes, the shooter in Buffalo who 2 weeks ago killed 10 people, the white supremacist killer, also sported a black sun. There are white supremacists and far-right groups who go to Ukraine to be trained. So there is a direct connection. As far as breaking free from the duopoly of Democrats and Republicans, just do it. Stop voting for them. That's my simple answer. But someone points out we should not be afraid to support the Russian people. Yeah, we just have to we have to oppose imperialism. And I think that's where our focus needs to be. We don't have to, and speak out against US interventions. And we don't have to pick sides and say this one is good or this one is bad. Speak up for humanity, speak out against imperialism.
John?
Yeah, 100% agree. I don't know what to say after Margaret speaks. I was like,
Well,
hey, she doesn't say everything. But no, on the
I got a
thing
question
about,
for you, John. Well, go ahead, but there's a question
Yeah.
directly to you also.
okay, but on the Lugansk thing, the thing about the how much of the military are there really independent folks, or was it just a ploy and things like that? Well, you know, for the reason that the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic founded themselves and wanted to be independent was because after 2014 and the coup, these Nazi forces were getting more prominence, becoming more of a terrorist threat. Like I said, they burned alive almost 40 people in the Odessa trade unions. And they said, we don't want any part of this. And they were mostly a Russian speaking population in the Donbass region. And they wanted to be independent, which was, you know, made a lot of sense. But the Lugansk militia, Lugansk People's Militia, they were doing 100% of the fighting before February. They had Russian advisors, but the forces up until February 22nd, 23rd, before the Russian intervention happened, it was just Lugansk people, because they always try to make it sound like, oh, this was just Russia doing this. That's just more of the US propaganda trying to justify their imperialism. And the other thing about I don't know about the Bloodstone operation, but I do know about the Operation Lusitania in 1915 to get the US into World War I, and then the Operation Gulf of Tonkin to get the US into the Vietnam War and what happened after that. 2 million Vietnamese killed, 500,000 agent suffering permanently from Agent Orange and other horrors like that. And we, of course, we know about the operations and weapons of mass destruction. They did some things like they'd have a warehouse full of the US soldiers. And they go into this warehouse, and they said, oh, this warehouse is full of chemical weapons. Come out with maybe some baby, they wouldn't allow the journalists to go in to see what was going on. And so they probably came out with some, baby powder or something, said, hey, this is anthrax. But the New York Times published it as facts. They were just lying. And time and again, the New York Times, from the Lusitania to the Gulf of Tonkin, you can find a lot of different newspapers, but definitely the New York Times, the paper of record, would publicize these things as if they're true and sell the war. And the New York Times had to apologize. And they said, well, the reason it happened was because we weren't verifying our facts. It seems like a paper should do that, but they do it over again. They're doing it now too. They're just a tool, like Margaret said, they're just a tool of the Pentagon. It's just when they seem objective, but when imperialist war starts, no, they're just a tool of the Pentagon. And in terms of the Nazis, the Nazi problem that's coming here, Newsweek and this German paper called Die Zeit, they did some articles, I think in January, about the threat of the Nazis in Ukraine. And it turns out that 17,000 white supremacists have gone through the Ukraine and gotten military training, and then they go back and they use it against us. And it's just become a hotbed of fascism there. Finally, this is one of the people I interviewed in the shelters. This woman, she looked like she was in her late 80s. She was by herself. She had lost everything because they took everything, bombed everything. She said, everything I have is on this bed. All she had was a pillowcase and sheets and things like that. And if you could see the misery in her eyes. And when I asked, what would you do if the Russian soldiers that were here now, if they left? She said, I'd be very afraid. So people in the anti-war movement here who are saying this is a Russian invasion and they're condemning Russia, put yourself in the place of the people from Donbass, whose children for 8 years have been terrorized and probably killed, many of them killed, 14,000 killed. They're under the threat of rape, terror, murder, bombings for 8 years. And when on February 22nd, the Ukrainian military was at the border, ready to come in, they were ready to finish the job. It was going to be genocide and a humanitarian crisis. Didn't the people of Donbass have a right to ask for help? Wouldn't you ask for help if your children are about to get slaughtered? And they took it. And Russia, basically, it had a responsibility to meet that demand, to help them, So we should think twice about that. Think about the people who are suffering from US imperialism historically and what they were going through before you start throwing accusations of invasion and condemnation. That's it.
Exactly. And yes, John, and I just wanted to add to that, had the US forced the Ukraine, because Ukraine does whatever the US wants, all they had to do was follow the Minsk II agreement that they signed. And that was necessary. It acknowledged that Donbass should have some sort of autonomy. It acknowledged language rights because they were banning the Russian language, among other things. But the US didn't really want peace. And I think it's very important. And I know people on the left differ in their opinions about whether the Russians should have gone in militarily. You still need to know why this happened. You still need to know the history. You still need to know how it was instigated. And I'm just looking at the chat, and yes, I know about the Nazi and Nazi collaborators being used to undermine the USSR, some of them being given US and Canadian citizenship, especially Canada. She was the foreign minister. She's now, I think, deputy prime minister of Canada. Her father was one of those, grandfather was one of those Ukrainian collaborators. So that is not something that the that is just Putin's propaganda.
Thank you, Margaret. John, there's a question that says, what was John's impression, if any, of the degree to which the average Ukrainian and Russian understand NATO to be the ultimate cause of the conflict?
I think, yeah, most people saw it as the U.S. that's funding this. Funding. Most people, I think, see in Ukraine anyway, see the 2014 as something that was funded by the U.S. and it makes sense because there's a lot of National Endowment for Democracy money there, and what they did was they hire young people, and then they'd go out and they probably did some positive things like saying let's fight against the oligarchs, let's do all this kind of stuff, and they get a grouping around them, and then they were being used for propaganda for the US. So yeah, I even saw this thing on a wall. It said ACAB. It was written in the English letters, not the the Russian letters, but it was ACAB, and I asked Alexei, what is this? All cops are bad. Oh, I said, yeah, that's a really progressive slogan here. They were taking US slogans that we use and then using them in Ukraine for the opposite reason, but they were taking kind of Western culture kind of thing and doing that stuff. So I think a lot of people saw that.
I see a question about Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians who oppose the Russian military operation, and what do we think of them? I think they should have been respected by the Minsk II agreement being respected. That would have respected their views. Ending this war, having serious negotiations, that would have kept this from happening. And now they're panicking. And now that Ukraine is clearly losing, some of them are calling Putin. Now, somebody else asked about the fractures in the European Union. Italy has publicly said, I think the prime minister met with Biden and said there should be negotiations. The UK is the biggest, it's always the biggest US puppet, very happily so, and the one that mimics US opinions on this situation. In fact, Ukraine had agreed to some concessions, and they sent Boris Johnson personally to meet with Zelensky and tell him no, and get his mind right and tell him not to do this. But this means people die. So that is the most important thing. This did not have to happen. I believe it is the fault of the US and the UK in particular. But yes, there are fractures in the EU because they can't get out of this mess they made for themselves. They can't live without Russian gas. They are not going to crater the ruble. They are hurting themselves. The US is asking countries all over the world to shoot themselves in the foot. Oh, don't buy Russian gas. And India said, actually, no, we screwed ourselves when you told us not to buy Iranian oil. So we're going to do what we want. And countries, by the way, there were votes in the UN condemning Russia and kicking Russia off of the pretend Human Rights Council, and many countries abstained. Many African countries abstained. So this trope of Russia being isolated is nonsense. That just means the US doesn't like Russia, but there are countries who have openly defied the US. And I want to say again that Biden and his people are fantasists. If they think China is going to break its strategic partnership with Russia to please them. So.
Thank you, Margaret. Maud, you're still speaking. There is a question to you. It says, Margaret, can you speak about the fracture in the European Union nation members as it relates to sanctions against Russia, which you partially
I think I was addressing that. You have some like Italy saying, let's talk.
Right.
Some like well, they're not EU, but European nation, the UK, are the most hawkish. Emmanuel Macron wants to talk to Putin a lot, but not really offer much. So, but as the longer this goes on, the more dissension you will see amongst them, because nothing that they hoped would happen has happened.
Great. I'm going to read a few questions if it's okay for folks. And some of it people may answer or not. Ruth Strauss says, just repeating here, wow, how great this webinar is. We would like to contribute to each org, but please do save the chat. We will do that and post a link somewhere to it to send it to registrants, since it has a lot of important links to all of your work, writings, etc. Thanks again. We will do it. And actually, after this is, once we're finished with the webinar, we'll get this out to everybody. Are there any good historical books that can help us understand what is going on in Ukraine? Because I remind people we're going to publish something from Greg Butterfield, but others have their answers. And how do we get to Americans who consider themselves progressives who refuse to listen to any other narrative but the mainstream narrative that Putin is evil? Stop there. Either one of you, John or Margaret.
Oh, I was thinking, my mind was wandering for a second, but the evil Putin thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same as that they do every time the first thing they do when they want to go to war is they vilify the target of U.S. imperialism, and like Margaret was saying, this is something that they promoted. This was a serious provocation. They knew what they were doing. They knew since 1990 when Gorbachev was stupid enough to unilaterally disarm and take away Warsaw. We saw what happened after that. But they were told, Gorbachev was given promises, and there's Freedom of Information Act documents now that we see that this is true, that he was time and again from the US leaders, from Western European leaders, that we will not go east. And he said, we won't go east and we won't even expand NATO. We're not going to make any more NATO states. Don't worry about it. Disband Warsaw. So he did. And now 20 years later, 20 years, they've doubled, NATO has doubled, and they doubled by surrounding themselves around the then Soviet Union, now Russia. And Ukraine was just the last straw. You're going to have a NATO member state with possible nuclear capability that can reach Moscow in 5 minutes, and not only that, led by neo-Nazis. Imagine if the Taliban went to in Afghanistan, took over, had the money, the US money, and they had $100 billion, and they took over Canada, and it was an anti-US government, and they had nuclear weapons, and the people leading the military was Al-Qaeda. What would the US do? So they knew this was a provocation. They're in fact, 3 years ago, the RAND Corporation, which is a CIA think tank, laid out the whole scenario of what they're doing right now. So we know this is, so when they start vilifying Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or the latest, they always call him the brutal dictator. I mean, talk about brutal. Biden just stopped he just froze the assets of Afghanistan, $9.5 billion. And that's going to cause 1 million children to starve to death. Biden is starving 1 million children to death, but nobody calls him a brutal dictator or insane. It's just, wow, it's too much.
Margaret, did you want to add anything?
I'm glad John brought up Afghanistan. Yeah, the US is, people in Afghanistan are selling their kidneys in order to survive because the US has stolen that country's assets. But yes, I don't have anything else to add to that.
No problem. Well, we're getting kind of towards the end. At least we've gone on for over an hour and 16 minutes. It's been an exciting webinar. And I know when we do the YouTube thing, we're not going to cut off the questions and comments, and we'll definitely get back to everybody. So before asking either both Margaret and John to have the last word of tonight, I just wanted to say a couple of things that I think are, that I want to get out there. One, of course, the book. We'll be getting information both from Margaret and John about the stuff that people were asking about. But I want to say that we're going to have an on-the-ground tour. John is going around the country to speak to groups. He's already been speaking to a lot of different people. But he'll be everywhere from Baltimore to New York to New Orleans, around the country, Denver, whatever. That's just some of the places. So keep in touch, because if you want to invite him to speak I can't speak for Margaret. I don't know if she wants to go with him, but that's a great idea if she could. But can't
That's a
speak
good
for
idea.
Margaret, only John, that if you would like to have John come and speak about his experiences in Donbass and get this information out, it's a great way to do one of the questions asked, and that is to really get into, into the grassroots, have a barbecue, have something in your backyard. We're not talking about indoor meetings, and they don't have to be big, but where we can dialogue with people. Because really the US NATO proxy war is killing people right here in the US, and we got to get that information out. So I won't go on any longer about that. If Margaret and John want to have the last word, and it'll be
Yeah,
difficult to say goodnight, but anyhow, go ahead.
Thank you. John, if you're going to be in New York and you're in New York, I definitely would love to join you. That would be great. But I want to thank everybody. I saw so many friends on the participant list, and I can't start naming names. I'll miss someone. So thank you. I thank everybody for joining us. It's more people than I thought, given Sharon, I asked Sharon how many people were registered, and I said, oh, it should be X amount, but it's more than I thought. So clearly there's interest. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Sharon and John.
Well, I just want to say thanks to Margaret, and one of the biggest contradictions that we have right now is we're going towards World War III, and the left forces and the socialist forces aren't united, and we need to get the information and then get the unity, and let's have some, forget about the sectarianism and all that kind of stuff. And I'm saying that because I want to highlight Black Alliance for Peace, because it's been so successful at getting different organizations, folks. I'm also a member of Black Alliance for Peace, getting them together in the same room and being able to do stuff together and work together. It's such a great model. I really want to commend them for that. And that's how we in the left and all the socialist movements, that's how we have to act. We have to act in the interest of the movement together, and we're a powerful force if we act together. And we've got the truth, and people are going to be suffering so much because of this, because of the war, because of the policies of the ruling class and how they invest, and because of all these things are coming to fore. All the ideas about the Democrats, well, you can trust them. Well, now you can't. Every one of them voted for that bill. So we have to build a movement, not build up these enabling politicians. And that's it. Thanks.
We will win.